The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the third-floor office as Claire typed away at her computer. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, entering numbers and data like she did every single day. To everyone around her, she was just another face in the crowd. The quiet woman in cubicle 47 who always arrived 15 minutes early and left right at 5 o'clock. Nobody really knew much about Claire. She'd been working at Henderson Insurance for 3 years now, and in all that time she'd never made waves. She didn't gossip by the water cooler. She didn't complain about deadlines. She just did her work, smiled politely when people said good morning, and kept to herself. But there was one thing people did notice about Claire. Every month, without fail, she'd bring in homemade cookies for the office. Not the store-bought kind either. Real, honest-to-goodness homemade chocolate chip cookies that melted in your mouth. It was her small way of being part of the team without actually having to be the center of attention. The other analysts in her department had tried to get to know her better over the years. They'd invite her to happy hour on Fridays. She'd politely decline. They'd ask her to join the office softball team. She'd smile and say she wasn't very athletic. Someone once asked if she had any hobbies, and she'd simply said she liked reading and baking. That was it. Nothing more. What nobody knew was that Claire had a secret. A big one. The kind of secret that sat in her chest every single day. Heavy and silent. Every time she heard music playing in a store or a restaurant, she'd feel something stir inside her. Something painful and beautiful at the same time. But she'd push it down, lock it away, and focus on whatever task was in front of her. Her apartment reflected the same careful distance she kept from everything. It was neat and simple. A small couch, a coffee table, a television she barely watched. But there was one room she never went into. The second bedroom remained locked, and if anyone had ever visited her home, which they hadn't, they might have wondered what she was hiding in there. Life went on like this, day after day, year after year. Claire had convinced herself that this was enough, that staying small and invisible was safer than being seen. She'd built walls around herself so high that even she sometimes forgot what she was protecting. Then one Tuesday afternoon in late October, everything started to change. The company was planning its annual charity gala. It was a big deal at Henderson Insurance. They'd rent out a fancy hotel ballroom, invite clients and employees, and raise money for local children's hospitals. Everyone was expected to attend, and Claire always went, standing in the corner with a glass of sparkling water, counting down the minutes until she could leave. This year, though, there was a problem. Rachel, the event coordinator, was in a complete panic. She'd been running around the office all morning, her phone pressed to her ear, stress written all over her face. By lunchtime, word had spread about what was wrong. The pianist they'd hired had canceled. Some kind of family emergency. The gala was in 3 days, and Rachel had called every musician in the city. Either they were already booked or they wanted twice the budget she had available. She was desperate. During lunch, a group of employees sat in the break room discussing the situation. Claire was there too, quietly eating her sandwich in the corner like always. "Maybe we could just play recorded music," someone suggested. "No way," another person replied. "The whole point is to have live entertainment." "It's classier. Does anyone here play an instrument?" someone else asked. The room fell silent. People looked at each other and shrugged. Then Tom from accounting spoke up. He was the guy who remembered everything about everyone, the unofficial office historian. "Wait a minute," he said, looking thoughtful. "Didn't Claire mention something about playing piano once? It was like 2 years ago. Someone was talking about their kids' piano lessons, and I think she said something." Everyone turned to look at Claire. She felt her stomach drop. Her sandwich suddenly felt like a rock in her hands. "Claire?" Rachel appeared in the doorway as if she'd been summoned by magic. "Do you play piano?" Claire's mouth went dry. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd spent 3 years avoiding. "I used to," she said quietly. "A long time ago." Rachel's face lit up like someone had just handed her a winning lottery ticket. She rushed over to Claire's table and sat down. "Please," Rachel said, and there was real desperation in her voice. "I know it's a huge ask, but we're completely stuck. You wouldn't have to play anything complicated. Just some background music during the cocktail hour. Simple jazz standards, that kind of thing. Please, Claire. You'd be saving my life here." Claire felt trapped. Every instinct told her to say no, to make up an excuse, to protect the walls she'd built so carefully. But Rachel looked so hopeful, and everyone was watching. and saying no would create the exact kind of scene Claire spent her life avoiding. "I'm really not very good," Claire said, which wasn't true, but saying it felt necessary. "I don't need good," Rachel said quickly. "I just need someone who can play something pleasant while people are mingling. That's all. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated." Claire's hands were shaking slightly under the table. She clasped them together, trying to steady herself. Memories were trying to push their way up from the place where she kept them buried. A grand stage. Bright lights. Her mother's proud smile. Her father's encouraging nod. The feel of keys under her fingers. The way music used to flow through her like breathing. And then the other memory. The one that had made her lock that second bedroom. The reason she'd walked away from everything. "Claire?" Rachel's voice brought her back to the break room. "What do you say?" Everyone was still watching. Waiting. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. "Okay," Claire heard herself say. The word came out barely louder than a whisper. "I'll do it." Rachel practically jumped up from her chair. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver." She was already pulling out her phone, probably to cross one crisis off her very long list. "The gala is Friday night at 7. Just simple background music." "You're amazing, Claire, really." As Rachel hurried out of the break room, already moving on to the next problem, the other employees went back to their conversations. But Claire just sat there, her lunch forgotten, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she just agreed to? She hadn't touched a piano in 15 years. Hadn't let herself even think about music, not really. And now she'd promised to play in front of hundreds of people. That night, Claire stood outside the locked door of her second bedroom. Her hand rested on the doorknob, but she couldn't make herself turn it. Not yet. On the other side of that door was a past she'd spent 15 years running from. 3 days. She had 3 days to figure out if she could face it. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside her window. Car horns, distant sirens, the rhythm of life continuing on while she felt stuck in place. Around 2 a.m, she finally got up. Her bare feet padded across the hardwood floor until she stood once again outside that locked door. This time, her hand didn't just rest on the doorknob. She turned it. The door opened with a soft creak. Claire reached for the light switch, and when the room flooded with brightness, she had to blink a few times. Dust particles danced in the air. Everything was exactly as she'd left it 15 years ago. In the corner sat a black upright piano. Sheet music was still stacked on top of it, yellowed with age. On the walls hung framed photographs and certificates. A younger version of Claire smiled out from those pictures, holding trophies and standing on stages in beautiful dresses. In one photo, she couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her legs barely reaching the piano pedals, but her hands were already moving across the keys with confidence. Claire walked slowly into the room, as if moving through water. She ran her finger along the piano's closed lid, leaving a trail in the dust. How many hours had she spent at instruments like this one? Thousands? Tens of thousands? She'd started playing when she was 4. Her mom had been a piano teacher, giving lessons out of their home to neighborhood kids. Claire could still remember sitting on the floor of the music room, playing with her toys while students practiced scales and simple songs. One day, after a lesson ended, little Claire had climbed onto the bench and perfectly played back everything she'd just heard the students struggling with. Her mom had stood in the doorway, frozen in surprise. That's when they'd realized Claire had something special. Not just talent, but a gift. The kind that comes along maybe once in a generation. By the time she was 6, Claire was already beyond what her mother could teach her. They'd found her a renowned instructor in the city, a stern woman who'd trained concert pianists. Claire had loved it. Every lesson, every practice session, every competition felt like coming home. She won her first major competition at age 8. Then another at 9. By 10, she was performing in venues that most adult musicians only dreamed of. People started calling her a prodigy. Newspapers wrote articles about her. Music schools were already competing to promise her full scholarships when she'd be old enough to attend. Her parents had been so proud. Her dad would take time off work to drive her to competitions, sometimes traveling across the country. Her mom would help her practice, sitting beside her for hours, offering gentle corrections and endless encouragement. They never pushed her. They didn't have to. Claire had loved music more than anything in the world. She remembered her 12th birthday. She'd performed at Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall. She could still feel the weight of that moment. Standing, backstage in an emerald green dress, her hands shaking with excitement and nerves, her mom had knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Just play from your heart, sweetheart. That's all you ever need to do." And she had. The performance had been magical. The audience had given her a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Afterward, famous musicians had come backstage to meet her. One of them had said she had the potential to be one of the greats. The future had stretched out before her like an open road. Juilliard was already interested in her. Concert halls across Europe were extending invitations. Her instructor was talking about a recording contract. At 12 years old, Claire's path seemed absolutely certain. Claire sat down on the piano bench now, in her dusty, forgotten room, and felt tears starting to slide down her cheeks. Because she knew what came next in the story. The part that had ended everything. She'd turned 17 in March. By then she was performing regularly, balancing school and music with the kind of determination only teenagers have. She'd been invited to perform at a prestigious concert hall in Boston. Not as a novelty or a young talent, but as a serious musician. It was supposed to be her official debut as an adult performer. The concert had been perfect. She'd played Rachmaninoff and Chopin, pieces that would challenge musicians twice her age. The audience had loved it. The reviews the next day would call it extraordinary, transcendent, the announcement of a major new talent. Her parents had been in the audience, of course. They'd never missed a single performance. After the show, they'd taken her out for a late dinner, celebrating with chocolate cake and talking about all the opportunities this would open up. Her dad had joked that he'd need to hire a secretary just to manage all the requests that would be coming in. Her mom had held her hand across the table and told her how grateful she was to have witnessed Claire's gift unfold. They'd said goodbye to her around midnight at her hotel. She was staying in Boston for a few more days for interviews and meetings. Her parents were driving back home, a 3-hour trip. They'd wanted to be back for work the next day. Claire had gone to sleep that night happier than she'd ever been. She'd dreamed about music, about stages, about all the beauty she was going to create and share with the world. The phone call came at 4 in the morning. There'd been an accident on the highway. A drunk driver had crossed the center line. Her parents' car had been hit head-on. They'd died instantly, the police officer told her. They hadn't suffered. Claire remembered collapsing on the hotel room floor. She remembered screaming until her voice gave out. She remembered the piano in the hotel lobby and how the sound of someone playing it the next morning had made her physically sick. At the funeral, people kept telling her that her parents had died happy, that they'd just watched her greatest triumph, that their last hours had been filled with pride and joy. Everyone seemed to think this should comfort her. But all Claire could think was that if she hadn't been a pianist, her parents would still be alive. If there had been no concert in Boston, they wouldn't have been on that highway at 4 in the morning. If she'd been normal, if she'd never touched a piano, if she'd never had this stupid gift, her parents would still be here. The guilt had been crushing. It didn't matter that it wasn't logical. It didn't matter that everyone told her it wasn't her fault. In her grief-stricken mind, music had taken her parents away from her. She'd withdrawn from all her upcoming performances. She'd told Juilliard she wasn't coming. She'd locked her piano in a room and never touched it again. For 15 years she'd lived the smallest life she could manage, as if making herself invisible could somehow balance out what she'd lost. Now, sitting in this room full of ghosts and memories, Claire looked at her hands. These hands that had once brought joy to thousands of people. These hands that her mother had guided through their first scales. These hands that her father had photographed proudly as they flew across the keys. In 3 days, she'd promised to play again. The thought terrified her, but somewhere deep inside, underneath all the fear and guilt and grief, something else was stirring. A tiny voice that maybe, just maybe, it was time. The next morning at work, Claire could barely concentrate. Her fingers kept twitching, remembering patterns and movements she thought she'd forgotten. Every time she tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of her, she'd see piano keys instead of numbers. During her lunch break, she sat alone in her car and did something she hadn't done in years. She searched for piano videos on her phone. Her hands trembled as she watched a young performer play a simple jazz standard. It looked so easy, so natural. But could she still do it? That evening, Claire went home and stood in front of the piano again. She'd left the door open this time. The dust had settled, and the room didn't feel quite as haunted as it had the night before. She sat down on the bench and lifted the keyboard cover. The keys were yellowed with age, some of them sticking slightly. This piano hadn't been tuned in 15 years. It would sound rough, imperfect. But maybe that was fitting. Claire placed her fingers on middle C, just one note. She pressed down and the sound filled the small room. It was slightly out of tune, but it was still there. Still real. She played a simple scale, C major, the easiest one there is. Her fingers remembered the pattern automatically, like riding a bike. Up and down, up and down. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of denial but not gone. Then she tried a chord. Then another. Her hands were stiff and out of practice, but they knew what to do. It was strange and painful and wonderful all at once. She spent 2 hours that night just playing simple exercises. Things she'd learned when she was 5 years old. Her fingers stumbled and missed notes. Her timing was off. But she kept going, and slowly, tiny pieces of her old self started to wake up. The next day was Thursday. One day before the gala, Claire called in sick to work, which she'd never done before unless she was actually ill. She spent the entire day at her piano, working through the stiffness, trying to remember what it felt like to really play. She practiced the songs Rachel had requested. Simple jazz standards, Autumn Leaves, Fly Me to the Moon, The Way You Look Tonight, songs that any decent pianist could play with their eyes closed. For someone who'd once performed Rachmaninoff at Carnegie Hall, this should have been easy. But it wasn't easy. Not because the notes were hard, but because every time she played, she felt 15 years of locked-away emotion trying to break through. Her chest would get tight. Her eyes would fill with tears. She'd have to stop and breathe and remind herself that she could do this. By Thursday evening, her fingers hurt. Her back ached from sitting at the piano for so long. But something had shifted. The music didn't feel quite as painful anymore. It felt more like greeting an old friend you'd lost touch with, awkward at first, but slowly becoming familiar again. Friday arrived. The day of the gala. Claire woke up with her stomach in knots. She could barely eat breakfast. She got dressed for work, but couldn't remember the drive there. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. At the office, Rachel stopped by her cubicle with a huge smile. "Tonight's the night." "I can't thank you enough for doing this, Claire. You're literally saving the entire event." Claire managed a weak smile. "It's just background music. Nothing special." "Still," Rachel said, "you're a lifesaver. The event starts at 7, but can you be there by 6? Just to test the piano and get comfortable with the space?" "Sure," Claire said, her voice barely steady. The workday dragged on forever. Claire couldn't focus on anything. Tom from accounting asked her if she was feeling okay. She looked pale, he said. She told him she was fine, just tired. Finally, 5 o'clock came. Claire went home and changed into a simple black dress. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would draw attention. She wanted to blend into the background, just play her quiet music and disappear. The hotel was downtown, one of those old, elegant buildings with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Claire arrived at 6 on the dot, carrying nothing but her purse and a folder of sheet music she probably wouldn't need. The songs were simple enough that she could play them from memory if she had to. A hotel staff member directed her to the ballroom. It was massive. Round tables filled the space, each one decorated with white linens and centerpieces. A small stage had been set up at the front, and there it was. A beautiful black grand piano polished and gleaming under the lights. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She'd played on grands before, of course. Some of the finest pianos in the world, but she hadn't expected to see one here, and something about it made everything feel more real, more serious. She walked slowly to the stage, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. The ballroom was empty except for catering staff setting up in the back. She had the space to herself. Claire sat down at the piano bench and just looked at the keys for a moment. This instrument was nothing like her dusty upright at home. This was a professional concert piano, probably worth more than her car. She touched the keys gently. They were smooth, perfectly weighted, responsive. She played a few soft notes, testing the sound. The piano was beautifully tuned. The tone was rich and clear, filling the ballroom with warmth. This was a serious instrument. Rachel had said to play simple background music. Just something pleasant while people mingled and chatted. Nothing that would draw attention. Claire could do that. She would do that. She started with Autumn Leaves, playing it simply and quietly. Her fingers were less stiff than they'd been yesterday. The practice had helped. She moved through the song carefully, keeping it gentle and unobtrusive. Background music, that's all this needed to be. But as she played, something strange started to happen. Her fingers wanted to do more. They wanted to add flourishes, to explore the harmonies deeper, to make the music richer. She had to actively hold herself back, keep it simple, stay safe. She practiced for about 30 minutes, running through all the songs on her list. By the time she finished, some of the early guests were starting to arrive. Hotel staff were lighting candles on the tables. The bartenders were setting up the bar. The event was beginning. Claire's heart was pounding. Her hands felt clammy. She wiped them on her dress and took a deep breath. She could do this. It was just background music. Nobody would really listen. Nobody would really care. She just had to play quietly for an hour and then she could disappear. Rachel rushed past the stage, clipboard in hand, looking stressed but excited. She gave Claire a quick thumbs up and mouthed "thank you" before hurrying off to deal with something else. More people started filtering in. Claire recognized some faces from work. Mr. Henderson, the company president, was greeting guests near the entrance. Women in evening gowns and men in suits filled the room with chatter and laughter. It was 7 o'clock. Time to start. Claire placed her hands on the keys, took one more deep breath, and began to play. The music floated out across the ballroom, gentle and unassuming. Just like she'd promised. Just like everyone expected. But what nobody knew, not even Claire herself, was that before this night was over, something was going to break open. Something that had been locked away for far too long, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. For the first 20 minutes, everything went exactly as planned. Claire played softly, her fingers moving through familiar jazz melodies while guests mingled and chatted. She kept her eyes down, focused on the keys, trying to make herself invisible. The ballroom filled with the buzz of conversation. People laughed at jokes. Ice clinked in glasses. The catering staff moved smoothly between tables with trays of appetizers. Nobody was really listening to the music. It was just pleasant sound in the background, exactly what Rachel had asked for. Claire felt herself starting to relax slightly. She could do this. She was doing this. Just another 40 minutes and she'd be done. She'd kept her promise, helped out her co-worker, and she could go back to her quiet life. Everything would go back to normal. She transitioned into The Way You Look Tonight, keeping it gentle and simple. Her hands knew these songs so well that she didn't have to think about what came next. The music just flowed, easy and uncomplicated. Then something caught her eye. Near the front of the ballroom, an older couple had started dancing. Not formal ballroom dancing, just swaying together slowly, holding each other close. The woman's head rested on the man's shoulder. They looked like they'd been dancing together for decades, moving as one person instead of two. Claire watched them for a moment, and suddenly she wasn't in the hotel ballroom anymore. She was 12 years old, standing in her parents' kitchen. Her mom and dad were dancing to old records, moving around the small space between the refrigerator and the table. Her dad would spin her mom and they'd both laugh. Sometimes they'd pull Claire in too, the three of them dancing in a silly circle until they were all dizzy and happy. Her fingers stumbled on the keys. She caught herself and kept playing, but something had cracked open inside her chest. That memory, so vivid and painful and beautiful, wouldn't go away. The song ended. She should start another simple jazz standard. That was the plan. Stay safe, stay quiet, stay invisible. But her hands moved on their own, finding different notes. Richer notes. Deeper notes. She started playing a melody her mother had loved. A classical piece. Nothing like the background jazz she was supposed to be playing. Her fingers remembered it perfectly, even after all these years. Every phrase, every delicate turn of melody. The music swelled slightly. Not loud, but fuller. More alive. Claire felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she kept playing. She couldn't stop now even if she wanted to. The music was pulling something out of her. something that had been trapped for 15 years. A few people near the stage stopped talking and turned to listen. The change in the music had caught their attention, but Claire didn't notice. She was lost somewhere else now, somewhere between memory and the present moment. Without planning to, without even consciously deciding, her fingers shifted into something bigger. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece she'd played on her 17th birthday, the last piece she'd performed before everything fell apart. Her hands flew across the keys now, no longer holding back. All the technique she'd spent years burying came rushing back. The runs were clean and precise. The chords rang out with power and emotion. This wasn't background music anymore. This was something else entirely. More people stopped talking. Heads turned toward the stage. The conversations that had filled the room started to quiet down. Someone near the bar put down their drink to listen. Claire's vision blurred with tears, but her fingers never faltered. She knew this piece in her bones. Every note was connected to a memory. Her mother sitting beside her during practice, counting out the rhythm. Her father listening from the doorway, his eyes closed, getting lost in the music. Her teacher nodding approval when she finally mastered the difficult passages. She was playing for them now. For her parents. For the girl she used to be. For all the music she'd locked away. The grief poured out of her fingers and into the keys. So did the love. So did 15 years of silence and pain and longing. The entire ballroom had gone quiet. 200 people stood frozen. Drinks forgotten. Conversations abandoned. All eyes on the small woman at the piano who was playing as if her life depended on it. Mr. Henderson stood near the entrance with his mouth open. He'd worked with Claire for 3 years and had no idea. Nobody had any idea. Tom from accounting whispered to the person next to him, "That's Claire, the data analyst from our floor." The other person just shook their head in disbelief. Rachel stood off to the side, her clipboard hanging forgotten at her side, tears streaming down her face. Whatever she'd expected when she asked Claire to play some simple background music, it wasn't this. This was something else, something extraordinary. Claire's hands moved faster now, attacking the more powerful sections of the concerto. Her whole body was engaged, swaying with the music, feeling every note not just in her fingers but in her chest, in her breath, in her soul. She wasn't thinking anymore. She was just feeling, just remembering, just letting everything she'd buried come pouring out. The couple who'd been dancing had stopped, standing still on the dance floor, holding hands and watching in awe. The woman had tears on her cheeks. The man squeezed her hand tighter. Even the catering staff had emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the music. They lined up along the back wall, their work forgotten, witnessing something they'd never forget. Claire's tears fell freely now, splashing on the keys, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. This was the first honest thing she'd done in 15 years. The first time she'd let herself feel everything instead of pushing it down and away. It hurt. God, it hurt so much. But it was also like breathing after holding her breath for too long. She played through the pain, through the guilt, through the grief that had defined her adult life, through all the years of telling herself that her gift had been a curse, that music had taken her parents from her, that she deserved to be small and forgotten. But as her fingers flew across the keys, something else emerged too, joy, the pure, undeniable joy that had made her fall in love with music in the first place. The joy her mother had always said was the most important thing. Play from your heart, her mom had told her before that last performance. And now finally, after all these years, that's exactly what Claire was doing. The music built to its powerful climax. Claire's hands stretched across the keyboard, pulling out every bit of emotion the piano could give. The sound filled the ballroom, filled every corner, filled every heart of every person listening. And then suddenly, it was over. The final notes hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. Claire's hands lifted from the keys. She sat there, breathing hard, her whole body shaking, suddenly aware of where she was, of what she'd just done. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then, like thunder, the applause began. It started with one person, then another, then everyone at once. 200 people erupting into applause, many of them with tears on their faces, all of them having witnessed something they'd never expected to see at a company charity gala. People were standing, giving her a standing ovation, but Claire barely registered it. She was overwhelmed, exposed, terrified. She stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs, her vision swimming, and without looking at anyone, she walked quickly off the stage and out of the ballroom. She had to get out. She had to escape. She'd broken everything open, and now she didn't know how to put it back together. Claire found herself in a quiet hallway outside the ballroom, leaning against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her whole body was trembling. She felt like she'd just run a marathon, or survived a storm, or both at the same time. What had she done? She was supposed to play simple background music. Instead, she'd completely fallen apart in front of everyone she worked with. They'd all seen her cry. They'd all witnessed her pour out 15 years of grief and pain. There was no taking it back now. No pretending it hadn't happened. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Rachel approaching slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a frightened animal. "Claire," Rachel said softly. "Are you okay?" Claire let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. "I'm sorry. I was supposed to play jazz. I don't know what happened. Are you kidding?" Rachel's eyes were wide. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever heard. Claire, where did you learn to play like that?" Before Claire could answer, more people started emerging from the ballroom. Tom from accounting, a few other co-workers. They kept their distance but looked at her with expressions she'd never seen before. Awe, curiosity, concern. Mr. Henderson appeared, walking straight up to her. Claire instinctively straightened up, expecting to be in trouble for disrupting the event. "Ms. Chen," he said. His voice was gentle. "I've worked with you for 3 years and I had absolutely no idea. That was extraordinary. Would you be willing to tell me your story?" And so, standing in that quiet hallway with a small group gathered around her, Claire finally told the truth, about her childhood as a prodigy, about performing at Carnegie Hall when she was 12, about her parents and their endless support, about the concert in Boston and the phone call at 4 in the morning, about the guilt that had convinced her to lock everything away. People listened in silence. Some had tears in their eyes. When she finished, nobody seemed to know what to say. Finally, Tom spoke up. "Claire, it wasn't your fault. You know that, right? The accident, I mean. It wasn't because of your music." "I know that now," Claire said quietly. "In my head, I've always known it. But my heart took a lot longer to catch up." Rachel wiped her eyes. "What you just played in there, that was beautiful. Not just technically, but emotionally. You gave everyone in that room a gift tonight, whether you meant to or not." Over the next few weeks, Claire's life began to change in ways she never expected. Someone at the gala had recorded part of her performance on their phone. Despite Claire's initial panic, they asked her permission before doing anything with it. After a lot of hesitation, she said okay. The video was posted online. Within days, it had thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. People shared it everywhere, captivated by the story of the quiet office worker who turned out to be a hidden musical genius. The comments were full of people saying how her playing had moved them to tears, how they'd listened to it over and over. Claire's old piano teacher reached out after seeing the video. So did some musicians she'd known before her parents died. They didn't pressure her or judge her for walking away. They just wanted her to know they'd thought about her over the years and were happy to see her playing again. A local concert hall contacted her, asking if she'd be interested in performing. The request terrified her at first. She almost said no automatically, but then she thought about how it had felt to play at the gala once she'd stopped holding back. Painful, yes, but also freeing. Also right, she told them she needed time to think about it. Time to practice. Time to figure out who she was now as a musician and as a person. At work, things were different too. People knew her story now. They looked at her differently, treated her differently, but not in a bad way. They just saw her more completely. Tom started asking her about music during lunch. Rachel invited her to coffee and they actually became friends, real friends, not just co-workers. Mr. Henderson called her into his office one day. Claire had been nervous, but he just wanted to tell her that if she needed flexible hours to pursue music, they could work something out. The company valued her, he said, and wanted to support her growth in whatever direction that took. 3 months after the gala, Claire stood backstage at a small concert hall downtown. It wasn't Carnegie Hall. It was just a local venue with maybe 300 seats, but it felt massive. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding. She was more nervous than she'd been in 15 years. The concert was a tribute to her parents. She'd planned the whole program around pieces they'd loved. Some classical, some jazz, some pieces she'd written herself in the weeks leading up to this night. She'd spent hours at her piano, which she'd finally had tuned, rediscovering what it meant to create music not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Rachel was in the audience. So was Tom and several other people from work. Her old teacher was there too, sitting in the third row with a proud smile. But the first two seats, the ones with the best view, Claire had left empty. For her mom and dad, it felt right. When it was time, Claire walked out onto the stage. The applause was warm and encouraging. She sat at the piano, looked out at the audience, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Thank you all for coming, she said into the microphone. Her voice was steady. This concert is dedicated to my parents, who taught me that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about sharing what's in your heart even when it's scary. Especially when it's scary. She turned to the piano and began to play. This time there were no tears. Just music, pure and honest and free. She played for her parents. She played for the girl she used to be and the woman she'd become. She played for everyone in the audience who'd ever lost something precious and had to find their way back to themselves. The concert lasted an hour. When it ended, the applause was thunderous. People stood clapping and cheering. Claire stood and bowed, and for the first time in 15 years, she felt like herself again. Completely herself. After the concert, people came up to talk to her, to thank her, to share their own stories of loss and recovery. An older woman told her that she'd given up painting after her husband died. But watching Claire's journey had inspired her to pick up a brush again. A teenage girl, maybe 16 years old, shyly asked if Claire would consider teaching. She'd been thinking about quitting piano because it felt too hard, but after seeing Claire's story, she wanted to keep going. Claire found herself saying yes. Yes to teaching, yes to more performances, yes to letting music back into her life, not as a burden or a source of guilt, but as what it had always been meant to be, a gift. She kept working at Henderson Insurance, but she cut back to part-time. The rest of her time went to music, teaching kids who couldn't afford expensive lessons, performing at nursing homes and community centers, working on her own compositions. She started a small foundation in her parents' names to help young musicians from low-income families. Her apartment changed too. That second bedroom was no longer locked. The door stayed open and music flowed out of it regularly. She'd added photos of her parents to the piano so they could watch her play. Sometimes she'd talk to them while she practiced, telling them about her day, asking their advice, feeling their presence in the music. Life wasn't perfect. Some days were still hard. Grief didn't just disappear because she'd had one breakthrough moment. But she'd learned to carry it differently, not as something to hide from, but as part of her story, part of what made her music deeper and more meaningful. One evening, about a year after the gala, Claire sat at her piano as the sun set outside her window. She wasn't practicing for a performance or teaching a lesson. She was just playing for herself, for the joy of it. Her fingers moved across the keys, creating something new, a melody that was sad and hopeful at the same time. A piece about loss and recovery, about silence and sound, about the long journey back to yourself. And as she played, Claire realized something important. Her parents hadn't died because of her music. They'd lived more fully because of it. They'd spent 17 years watching their daughter do what she loved, and their last night on earth had been spent celebrating her success. That wasn't a tragedy to feel guilty about. That was a gift to be grateful for. The simple tune she'd been asked to play at that company gala had unlocked something far more valuable than just her technical skill. It had unlocked her life. Her real life. The one she'd been meant to live all along. Music had never been her curse. It had always been her blessing. And finally, beautifully, she was ready to accept it.